Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our Couples Therapy Book Club with Couples Counseling ATL. I'm joined today with all of our, not all, but most of our amazing therapists. And thank you for everyone who is able to make it today to talk about a really interesting book that I enjoyed. I hope you did too. It's called Us, Getting Past You and Me to Build a More Loving Relationship by Terry Real. All right, Liz or Matthew, can you say something so we can see the book?
Hello.
Hello.
I just have my notes. I don't have the book right now. I listened to the audio. But it was very interesting, guys. I will say the audio, you were saying earlier, Liz, that the opening being by Bruce Springsteen, that really threw me for a loop. I didn't expect that. I saw Bruce Springsteen years ago live in concert. Amazing musician. Had no idea that he had benefited so much from Terry Real's and would have never guessed that he struggled before. So that was wonderful to hear his story. And I just want to start with a quick synopsis of the book, and then we can get into just any of your key takeaways, your impressions, obviously any feedback as well if there was any parts that you didn't enjoy. But I think this book was refreshing in the field of couples therapy because Terry Real really does have a very different style of couples therapy, and I think a different framework for examining couples issues, especially when one or both people are particularly guarded, particularly struggling with vulnerability and intimacy and what he calls being walled off or being in more of a you and me separate compartmentalized space, and helping them to move to more of a relational, that's why he calls his form of couples therapy like relational life, moving towards a more relational way of being. And I think it definitely appeals to both men and women, but I think it really especially is probably helpful for more men than a lot of the books that I've read. So I think that when I was reading this, so much of this is universal, but I think it was particularly appealing and could be even especially beneficial for men. But some of the main ideas were that you can overcome toxic emotional habits. So that was hopeful. Also, that there's this concept of the adaptive child that we all formed as young children to deal with maybe the challenges of our home life that shows up no matter how old we are later. And so we need to learn how to identify and reparent ourselves and learn how to become a wiser, more adult version of ourselves, but also just being aware that when we're stressed out, we all regress into that adaptive child sort of place. So that was helpful. Some other ideas, some main ideas were that to move through conflict, you really have to ditch that core negative image of your partner. Again, when we're stressed, it's very easy to regress into that more two-dimensional black and white thinking where we think of our partner as bad guy, me good guy, you bad guy. So I think that was the key takeaway there, was just that it's really easy to just start thinking of them in this really two-dimensional way. And we have to recognize that we're doing that. And it's not fair to them. It's not fair to us. It doesn't help us to be in a relationship. And then you don't just recover from trauma, you learn how to rebuild. Many of us have had different sorts of capital T trauma, lowercase t trauma in our families, lots of things that have shaped who we are, but really helping us to learn to think of past hurts and ruptures in relationships and how it shaped us. But it was a very hopeful message of how we can rebuild a life past that. And then it just in conclusion, after going through all the main points, I would just say that he really thinks that with relationships, a you and me consciousness results in point scoring and power struggles. For real romantic fulfillment, we have to let go of the ego and embrace putting us before the you and me. And the helpful strategies that he talked about for achieving this includes that reparenting the adaptive child, letting go of those core negative images, and really implementing sort of us-focused feedback. And so that's a synopsis. I will now be quiet and let everyone else talk. Any initial impressions? What you liked about the book? What you were less of a fan about? Don't all jump at once.
I'll go. I really did like how he focused on that individual mentality, and that's what we're used to our whole entire life. And then now we're in this relationship and having that us mentality. It really made me wonder if kind of in Eastern cultures, if that there's that big of a transition or if it feels more natural over there. It definitely resonates with Western culture. So that was something I was thinking about, or just, I guess, curious about, if how this book would resonate in those more, can't think of the name right now, but when it's that us
Collectivistic.
collectivist thinking, the usness communities. So that I was just thinking, but I really like this idea, just to echo all of that.
I thought it was a fun and helpful book, both for myself and for my work. I found some of the stuff early in the book inviting me to think about how to take his concepts into my past and try to make sense of it. Real, I think, strength is his clarity and his ability to name. And so he gives you, I think, in this book, a couple of ways that Gottman, and I could talk about this later, but that Gottman has offered, but with a different perspective and slightly different way of thinking with other name. But there's a nice overlay throughout the book with what we do as a Gottman therapist, some of the approaches and interventions that we use. And I've used some of his language since. I think there was a lot of excitement when we finished the book, and then a number of us brought some of that language into our discussions. And that, I think, has been really helpful for folks, the wise adult, the adaptive child, and goes on and on.
I was going to talk about one of the main things that I really loved from the book was his description of the soft power and a very practical guide of how to approach conversations, say with your partner. But I had marked on the page here, like the 3 steps he described of what that soft power means. So he described that first, starting by letting your partner know that you need repair and asking if that's a good time. First, the question part was very interesting to me, and then that implies acceptance if your partner says, no, this is not a good time, right? And then trying to find another time to talk. Then number 2, he said, was like, after you've set on the time and your partner has agreed that is a good time to talk, thanking them or starting off with an appreciation. I think that's something that many times we forget to do. But what I specifically liked about this too is that he said, even if it's just the fact that you appreciate that the other person is willing to talk at that time, that's a great way to start with thanking. Thank you for being willing to talk about this right now. And then the third part, just like stating your intentions. For example, in a positive way, the example he used was, I want to clear the air between us so that I can feel closer to you. So that would be a way of setting up that repair. But I think overall, just the concept of that soft power, which is like a firm love. I think there are many synonyms to that, but just like remembering love and communicating in a way that can facilitate repair, which aligns so much with some of the Gottman work that we do. But I really like that description of the soft power and kind of having that formula to try to apply that to conversations.
Great insight. Thank you, Gio. Yeah, I agree. I love that.
I'll jump in here. I enjoyed reading this book because there was hope to it. No matter what you bring to the relationship, you're not doomed or anything. There is this level of hope. And I liked especially when he was talking about trauma, when in different parts, like the young version or the wise adult version. And I liked how the question that says, which part of you am I talking to? Just that mindset or putting that into perspective. I do a lot of parts work, especially through like EMDR and trauma and all of that. So that just really stood out to me. I was like, even like different parts work and stuff. So that was cool how they were talking about how to handle that trauma.
Yeah, thank you. And I like what you are saying, Jess, just about how he touches upon, I think, a lot of other therapy frameworks. I saw not only some references to popular trauma treatments like PARTS and EMDR, but also there felt like there was a pretty strong reference to dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT, with the mindfulness-based cognitive behavioral therapy of DBT. He talked about relational mindfulness, and really all good therapy, right? It helps you to step back and pause more and think more of, what are my own thoughts or feelings? What are their thoughts or feelings? Having a little bit more awareness versus that whole understandable but childlike reactivity that we all can step into when we're really stressed. I also saw some more systemic sort of references with talking about letting go of the ego and looking at more the eco or the ecosystem of the relationship. What sort of system are we creating at home? What sort of, that we're all, if we're in this together and we are really a unit, that's a different way of thinking than just thinking of singularly. And I can't remember, honestly, because it's been a while since I've read this, but I can't remember if he says it in this book or if it's just one of the times I saw him speak, but he has talked before about being an assist in recovery himself. And so this made me giggle a little bit, going back over my notes and just remembering how a lot of the work on the parts, but also the adaptive child sort of talk is really helpful if someone is stuck in that ego, me, myself, and I, walled off. It's me against the world, or it's me against this cartoon villain version of my partner. I think that was also hopeful and inspiring to see someone who identifies that way talk about how he's become much more relational and really talk about how it's very common, I think, especially in the Western world, like referencing back to Liz's discussion of cultural differences. I think it's very easy in the world that we have currently, and with all this discussion of narcissists. So it's very popular and hot topic right now to think of all of us, like any of us fall on the spectrum at any given point in time. And so this is particularly helpful if people, whether they're in couples therapy or not, or they're in your individual therapy with you, are struggling with more of this guarded me, myself thinking. And if they really are having just a lot of reactivity to their partner, if they're really getting activated or triggered by their partner, it would be easy just to think of them again as potentially just through a trauma lens or just through potentially a narcissistic lens. But I think this is a nice way of thinking in a more, like he said, ecological, or like what's the ecosystem, what's not only the person's individual history here, what's their partner's individual history, what's the dynamic that they're creating, and how can they, a la DBT, get more access to the prefrontal cortex and the wise mind and the adult 2.0 version of themselves, and not just the more reactive adaptive child. Anything else that resonated for you?
I'll jump in and say that one of the things, maybe to echo something, David, you said earlier, I love the clarity of Reel's sort of work here. And I really enjoy some of the forcefulness of his language. Love demands democracy. You can't love from either above or from below. Really statements that are very clear, very succinct. And the way that he will, again, Stephanie, I think it's like with you, was it this book? Was it a time I saw him talk? Was it one of his other books? But the calling out of the patriarchy. When he talks about systems, he doesn't just allude to systems in general. He'll very much say one of the biggest issues that, for instance, men in therapy, especially couples therapy, will face are a bunch of the messages that they get from patriarchy about their role, about the sort of the man's superior role in their relationship, assuming that it is a heterosexual one. And that is something that they essentially will need to unlearn in order to have the kind of relationship that will be most fulfilling. I know a lot of the work feminist scholars has been, at least for a very long time, about empowering women, about exploring the way that women have been hurt in patriarchy. And there is, while it is not as well known, it is, I think, almost as equally well researched about the way that patriarchy will affect men, how it requires us to, those of us who identify as such, requires us to cut off our emotions, requires us to hide, to put up a mask of strength and narcissism. And again, that these are skills that we are inoculated and inculcated in taught as children. And then when we get into a relationship, we find, my goodness, they do not help us as much. And I think it's really wonderful that he very much calls it out and just says, these are things you're going to need to learn. And while that can be difficult, it's not impossible when he's offering tools like, for instance, the relationship grid, something that I will very frequently incorporate with my clients. This idea of, where do you find yourself on these two axes, walled off or boundaryless, and grandiose or shameful? And that where you fall on these two axes in one of these four quadrants can tell you a lot about helping you to predict how you're going to very often react to your partner. So I think there is a lot here in this book especially for couples therapists, especially if you're working with men who, at least in my work, I have found to be, some of them require a lot more convincing. They have not They're not necessarily buying into the value, especially of couples therapy, or they're worried that they may not have the same emotional language fluency that their partners do. And so going into a session with their partner and a therapist they can feel under equipped, which just by its very nature will end up leaving them having to confront some messages about patriarchy, going into a position of weakness. So it's it's a really great book, really great resource, I think, for therapists.
Said Matthew, you got me thinking about his reference to the patriarchy. When I was first listening to it, I remember thinking exactly like the profile of the man that might come to couples therapy sometimes, who might find some of this language a little, what's the word? Just, it might be a little hard to continue to read. There are going to be some men who might not see the world the way that Terry Real sees it, and might not see through a feminist lens as much as Terry Real talks about. And so I do think that I think almost all couples therapists could benefit from this book. I think that there are a lot of men who might benefit from this book, but I also think that there's probably a strong group of men too, who a couples therapist might still be able to help with some of this, but who might, if they were recommended this book, would probably pretty quickly put it down, to be honest, because there is pretty strong feminist language and a feminist sort of perspective. And even though Terry Real might really do great work, or people who have trained and learned from his work might do really great work with that sort of man who does not see through a feminist lens, I do think that this particular book might not be the first book I'd recommend to a man with a similar history as Terry Real, even though someone like Terry Real, before Terry Real became Terry Real, someone who's like early Terry Real is probably the exact sort of male profile that this book will eventually speak to if they continue in couples therapy. One thing that Terry Real said that I'd love to read about the patriarchy in his own history, which I found really interesting, from one of his previous books, Fierce Intimacy, but he says it again in Us. He said, I grew up with a grandiose, overtly grandiose, covertly shame-filled father. I grew up with a mother who stood by and did not protect my brother and me. I call that the unholy triad of patriarchy. Irresponsible man, unhappy woman, boy who's sensitive in the middle, feeling both of their pain. And I thought that really struck me as probably part of the motivation for someone like Terry Real to write this book, because he's clearly done a lot of his own work. And he writes about how many men like him were unfairly propped up into this golden child, grandiose place, and simultaneously taught to not only think very highly of themselves, which doesn't always help relationships without humility, but also to be really guarded and keeping people at a distance, quickly to go to a place of shame and rage like his father. And so not being able to really connect in childhood and being forced into this sort of very like two-dimensional version of manhood is, I think, where a lot of the beginnings of sexism often happen. And it's a disservice to men, it's a disservice to boys, it's a disservice to anyone in a relationship. So even if a female begins that way too, obviously that can result in the same way. But it just made me very sad listening to a lot of the sort of the cases that he mentioned similarly to his own, where you can see why someone really, as an adult, comes off in such an off-putting way, in a very anti-relational way, in a really reactive or grandiose or narcissistic or rage-filled, entitled sort of way. But when you trace it back to their origins and the type of childhood they had, especially if they're raised in a more patriarchal way, you can see where it began, why it began. It makes so much sense. And it's also just sad when someone is 40 or 50 or 60 years old and they're coming into our office really struggling to connect with their partner, probably with a lot of damage already. And they may or may not agree with this sort of patriarchal view, but more often than not, they can at least see some of the damage that's been done by just trying to be a two-dimensional strong man or strong woman, right? Any thoughts on the patriarchy perspective that he brings up into the formation of this sort of profile?
But
Or something else?
But I think this speaks to that in his style, and something that I'm envious of Terry Real. is, and what I love about reading books that therapists write is when they put in like the dialogue that they have in session with clients, because I just like seeing other people's styles. And so I think something he does really well and what he's known for is that he is very like confrontational, but still in a safe way. And it almost feels like when reading it, like it makes you a little uncomfortable, but like in a good way, if that makes sense. Because it's similarly how, like, you know, in movies where they break that fourth wall and they stare into the camera, like you're not supposed to do that. Like you're not supposed to be confrontational. It's supposed to be like supportive and let your client get there on their own and be neutral. But he doesn't.
You're only supposed to validate and be warm ever.
Yeah. And he's like, no, choose a side. There is someone who's right in here. And I was just like, it's jolting. But I really, again, I think that's him fighting against the patriarchy or other things, just like what we are told. And I think there's a time and place, and he's really nailed that, figuring out that difference and when to do that. And I just think it's incredible and is super helpful to that male clientele that you just described. But I think it's beautiful, and I would love to be able to do that one day. But
this is our love letter to Terry Real.
I know.
Right? I agree, Liz. I love it. I sometimes, when I'm not in couples therapy, not doing much of it these days, but when I have in the past tried to channel Terry Real, it is nerve-wracking to build up sometimes the confidence to confront what is clearly an anti-relational behavior, or what is clearly something that needs to be addressed. Or sometimes there is an issue in couples therapy that is not an equal 50-50, both parties contributing to a dynamic. All of us in relationships, not just the sort of guy that he's talking about, all of us are sometimes guilty of doing damage in our relationships. And so I think it's nice to hear a therapist, like you're saying, write about how to still be safe and still be ethical in your confrontation of some of these problematic, we'll say, behaviors. So I think that this is very helpful, especially for couples therapists who might struggle, like many of us. This is not just, but that we struggle with maybe confronting, especially that sort of adaptive child that he talks about, like the acting out, mindless, like not even aware sometimes entitled and righteous, believing that I'm right in the way that I'm acting. That is sometimes really hard to confront, especially if someone really believes that they're right, someone really thinks that they're entitled to act this way, or they're not taking responsibility for the damage they've caused. There's lots of situations when it's very hard to confront, even when we know we need to confront it. Anything you struggled with this book? Speaking of problems, anything that was something maybe you don't quite agree with, or that you wish he had presented differently, or that didn't feel, I know we all say he's very clear, but is there anything that didn't feel clear? Just clear. I guess it was just a masterpiece.
I will say the type of client that I think might struggle with this are those who have suffered a certain amount of trauma and don't have access to their childhoods. I know a type of client that I see fairly frequently are ones, and this is often can overlap with that patriarchal male client, where they've suffered serious relational trauma in their childhoods, maybe through abuse, maybe through neglect, and the brain has essentially cut them off from those memories. And so they'll say, I don't remember a lot of my childhood. And I'd be very interested to know sort of what Real does with clients like that. Because if so much of talking about this is identifying this is your adaptive child's response to something like this, what happens when the adaptive child has retreated so deeply into a memory hole that you can't find them, that the conscious mind can't even find it. And so your own reactions, your own behaviors are a little bit of a mystery to you.
So true. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I think certainly there is a capability of one of the things that I think is maybe helpful, and maybe he would lean on slightly more is in those situations, is simply speaking about, does this work or does this not? Does this behavior that you're engaging in right now work or not? Which is, I think that is what, Liz, you were talking about, the confrontation, right? The sort of gentle confrontation. That's one of the things that I've taken a lot from his work, is this ability to, especially with that self-righteous presentation, both in my male, female, and non-binary clients who are they get stuck in, I shouldn't have to, or it's not fair. And being able to go, true, but is this working? Because you seem miserable in this particular dynamic that you've got going on with your partner. And you can, and Stephanie, this is something that you said very early on when we started working together, was you can either be right or you can be married. And I've literally heard Reel say that. And it's something that I've had to say to a number of clients, that this focus on that self-righteous stance, that being correct, that this is Matthew, this is just, it's not fair what they've done. Being able to, at least at first, say, absolutely, I agree with you. It isn't fair. It sucks. And we can process that, and we can try to get your partner to the place where they apologize. But but if we stay here, the cost will be your relationship. So you can either devote yourself to being correct, in whatever way correct happens to look in the particular dynamic, or you can reorient again toward this sort of us mentality. Obviously, trust needs to be rebuilt. You may need lots and lots of reassurance from your partner that they too are committed to that reassurance, committed to that us mentality for you to, and I think, again, that's where some of that confrontation can go. It can come in handy. Yeah.
No, that's a really good point. And going back to what you said about trauma, that this might be the most sort of difficult client with the limited information we got out of this book to really help a client that can't remember their childhood. We know, and I'm sure Jessica, our resident trauma expert, can also validate that Terry, I remember, it wasn't in this book, Terry Real, I remember him saying, though, that we don't remember trauma, we relive it. And I know, even if it's not in this book, that Terry Real would agree that what we're seeing in client sessions is what they lived a long time ago. They didn't often just get these deeply rooted grooves in their memory and in their behavior from nowhere. This isn't just a personality trait. They learned it. Their adaptive child created it in order to survive. I do think that memory is great, but I also know, all of us know, that it's not everything. What's conscious is not always, and it's great to have insight and awareness, but we also don't need that to completely help them with their history. It is a lot harder, though, to get their buy-in if they don't remember this being part of their history. And so that's just what I wanted to respond to about the trauma. And then the being right or being married, I've heard Gottman say it. I've heard Terry Real say it. I've heard so many couples therapy. I definitely did not invent that. I totally am just copying the masters there. But I do think that a lot of all the different sorts of couples therapy really help individuals to move out of this self narrative, and I'm the hero in my own narrative, and seeing everyone else as potentially wrong, to a much more of a subjective reality of, this is my thoughts or this is my perspective, but I could be wrong. And that sort of humility, they're entitled to their own perspective. It could be different than mine. That's a very elevated adult wise mind place to go. That's hard even for a couples therapist like me in my own relationship, I'll admit. But I love, and then I'll be quiet, but I love the last part of what you said, Matthew, that I thought was really helpful too, is just the confrontation that he uses and how he does it, seemingly graceful, but it is really hard. That's an art form that I have yet to master, is how to be confrontational in a kind way, in a way that is still effective, but that also doesn't just align with someone who's the most upset or feeling the most righteous. When someone doesn't feel like something's fair, it's understandable to get escalated, right? All of us have an innate, I think, desire for justice. And it's easy when you're stressed out to only focus on where I think I've been wronged. And so I think it's very difficult. And as we know from the Gottman method too, if somebody's in that fight or flight over 100 beats per minute, good luck having any sort of rational conversation. It is important to get them back down to a window of tolerance physiologically before they can even have any of these conversations. But we could definitely talk about how the Gottman method can still work well, I think, with relational life, Terry Real method. But I digress. Do you guys have any other thoughts on the trauma, on the confrontation, any of the great insights Matthew shared with us?
I got something here, is that I know it doesn't really do with trauma, Matthew, what you were saying, but I liked how Terry Real was talking about remembering love. Even in the worst fights, in the worst situations, just remember you still love that person. there's a reason you fell in love with them, or just helping with that mindset. And even as therapists, if you have a client couple that comes in and they are just bashing each other, World War III is happening, they just came out of a massive fight, a tool is like slowing it down and remembering, wait a second, do you remember when you first fell in love with each other? Or like the good parts, that side, and take it from the Gottmans, that shared fondness and admiration side of a friendship bubble, that foundation. So I liked how he incorporated that, and that will help couples. Yeah, I really am not a fan of my partner right now, but I did love them like 30 minutes ago, or there's still some good to them. That was just fun little tool or resource.
I'll tell you, Jessica, I think he did a really good job of laying that out. And I think also that compliments Gottman, that the title of the book is a reminder that our work is really in part to help two people remember that there's an us. And it's easier when there are good times, when there's harmony. But when it matters as much or maybe more in disharmony, that there are physiological barriers to continuing to think about the other. And he offers ways to think and reflect why that is from your history and your context that you're bringing into the relationship. And I find that concept or that reminder of that really helpful when I'm thinking about the repair checklist, for example, because that is a relational intervention. It is something that takes two. You can offer an olive branch, but to that person, it may feel like a stick. And so there eventually grows an understanding from both how to give and how to accept with the us. And oftentimes as you approach the need for a repair, the us disappears and it's the me. And so I thought that was my greatest reminder, Jessica. And I want to piggyback on what you said. I agree.
Thank you, David. I love that you're bringing it back full circle to the whole point of the book, right? To create a more loving relationship. That's a helpful, I think, reminder. That's one of the main goals for all of us as couples therapists, is to help couples to not just focus on the presenting issue that brought them to couples therapy, which usually is around ruptured trust or escalating arguments or the merry-go-round of whatever perpetual problem they keep disagreeing about. It is to hopefully get them beyond that and into back a place of harmony and love and more, like he says, an us, like a we-ness, that is the lovely reason you probably got together, right? So that's a great reminder. And I love the idea of how the Gottman method really does complement this with things like the repair checklist. When I was looking over my notes, it also, when you said the repair checklist, it made me think of the feedback wheel that he mentioned, which I found particularly helpful. And just to remind you guys, if you don't remember, it's a 4-part conversational structure that he didn't invent, but he uses. It's by Janet Hurley, and it's about telling your partner, like when a rupture happens or when you're upset, this is what happened. This is the story. And I like to make this kind of thought bubble almost when I'm sharing. This is the story I'm telling myself about what happened. And this is how I felt. And most importantly, the last part is, this is what would help me heal, or this is what would help me. So it's not just about interrupting whatever fight or pattern and bringing it to their awareness and just saying, the dishes again. It's not just about bringing it up or bringing it to their awareness. It's also about, reminding someone of the story that I might be telling myself. I think separating yourself from your thoughts also helps it to be, take the barbed wire off of it when there is an edge. The story I'm telling myself is that you're a jerk who doesn't give a damn about me, or whatever it is. And that way it's this the story. That's my mind. That's where my mind goes. And it's a way of also being humble. I got this. This is where my little adaptive child mind goes. And then not just leaving it there, which we also teach in Gottman method. It's about your job to teach your partner what you need in order to feel close to them again and to repair after the ruptures that are inevitable in any relationship. I like that language. I think it does complement the Gottman method. And that would probably be one of my favorite takeaways from the whole book, is just some of the, like you said, the dialogues, can't remember who said it, but the dialogues that he shares with couples, but then also I think the really practical, clear, very concise tools that are very practical, especially in a heated moment when you are feeling like your partner's a jerk, right? Any thoughts about the feedback wheel or any other kind of, I know we're getting close to time. Is there any other sort of favorite takeaway or like a key point from the book that really resonated for you? Okay. Thank you everybody for reading this book and for being willing to nerd out with me and talk about it. I love this. I love being able to read books on couples therapy and to discuss with you. It's one of my favorite times every month. Thank you. And for anyone watching or listening, we recommend this book. All of us liked it. It's very entertaining. It's not dry. If you are struggling with, especially, I think, lots of fighting, I think it's a particularly helpful book. So thank you. Have a great day, guys.